want to do now is let's go through some photographs that we photographed of Lisa and Dylan, and these are the shots. They're straight out of the camera, they're all raw, nothing's been done to these photographs whatsoever. But what actually is a histogram and what does it represent? Because as far as we're concerned, it's just peaks and valleys and it's all confusing. So what do we need to know? Well, let's go a little bit closer and let's have a look. So, what is a histogram? Well, it's a graphic representation of the number of pixels at each luminance value in an image. Now, here we've got different values. As you can see, we've got the value from all the way from black, which is 0, and then 255 is white. So even though we've got 0 to 255, there's not 255 levels of brightness. It's actually 256 because we have to count 0 as black, 255 as white, and that's how we go. Now, here we see the actual histogram. Of course, as you can see, the left side indicates shadow clipping. All right, so in other words, clipping basically means that we have no detail in blacks. On the right-hand side, we have the actual, it indicates highlight clipping, or this is the highlights. The way I like to remember it is SH, shadow highlights. Remember that. That'll actually really help you understand it. And of course, now the height of the peaks, what does that represent? Well, that's actually how many pixels you have in a particular range. So a common suggestion is to spread the pixel values evenly across the way here. And I'm thinking, well, you know what? That's not always the case. It's nice to have a nice little peak of a little mountain and then coming all the way down, but your histogram will never be perfect. So we have to understand that. Now, what about this red, green, blue? What does that basically mean? Well, it's made up of 3 colors, and red, green, and blue are the color channels. Now, when red and green actually overlap, you get yellow. When red and blue overlap, you get magenta, and of course, blue and green is cyan. And white appears when all 3 channels overlap. So as you can see, all of these sections over here. So what we'll do at times is actually remove the RGB histogram to reveal just the exposure part of it, and that'll actually help us even further. So what we have to do, guys, it depends on how you've actually photographed. As far as I'm concerned, I prefer to look at the back of the camera, or in my case, because I'm shooting mirrorless, I'm looking in the viewfinder and I am seeing detail in the highlights and detail in the skin tones. Of course, the brightest part of an image of a person usually should be of that person's face. Then that is where the detail should be, and everything will take care of itself. See, in the film days, you would expose for shadows, develop for the highlights, and with digital and transparency for that matter, it's a very different scenario. So what we're trying to do here, guys, is get detail in the brightest highlight in the face. And once you do that, or the dress, they both take care of each other. Does that make sense? So here we've got out of camera exposure. Yes, she's a little bit shiny. That doesn't mean that this is a bad exposure, nor does it mean it's a bad exposure if we have a deep shadow on her face. Of course, if you remember, this is actually photographing in full sun. So what I want to do now is let's flick this. You can see we can actually go to black and white. And if you look at these points here, the levels of brightness will be revealed. But I'm going to click my picker here. Now, do you see where my mouse is going? The little picker. And as we're doing that, you've got those levels of brightness is giving us like that 25. Do you see how that's very, very dark? It's not exactly black. It's not 0. 0 is black, no detail. It's pure black. If we go to the highlights, you'll start to see where it's getting closer to that 255 mark. So let's see if I've actually blown out anything. I'm just trying to see. As soon as we get to 255, let's look at that area. No, let me put my glasses on actually. I can see this a lot better. So it looks like we have pretty much detail everywhere. Now you might say, Jerry, well, why don't I just shoot aperture priority and then hope for the best, and then I can just get detail in my shadows and highlights and things like that. Well, of course you can. You can get more details in shadows only. You can lift up the midtones and all that kind of stuff. But can you see how we're starting to lose a bit of detail and we get a lot of grain? So nothing beats an in-camera good exposure rather than just trying to do it after the fact. Excuse my dog barking in the background there. He's probably missing Daddy there. But again, this is a good exposure. We have detail in skin tones. We have detail in highlights. Life is good. Let's go down a little bit further. This one here of Lisa and Dylan, I love the way the light is skimming off Dylan there. We've got beautiful highlights over there as well, deep shadows, but you can see quite clearly the detail in them. But again, if you want to increase the exposure, you can, but of course you're going to blow out the highlights. So if you expose well, that exposure slider will hardly be touched. You might just want to put some detail in those shadows. Personally, I love deep, dark shadows. It gives us beautiful depth and dimension and drama. It's one of the signatures to my work, which I really love. So let's just keep on going down and find some different shots here as well. So again, I love the fact that we're playing with shadows. Those half shadows underneath a guy's eyes, very masculine, looks good. I wouldn't do that for a girl, so I make sure her eye socket is completely lit. Love the shadow on her lips. It makes the lips look fuller, as well as the shadow underneath her top lip, which is amazing. Now let's go to this. This is going to be almost impossible to get a perfect exposure, short of actually using off-camera flash, balancing that light that's hitting behind her veil and so on. Now let's put our little picker here. So again, let's look at the RGB there. So again, although I'm going to flick it to black and white, it still gives us the luminance values from 0 to 255. So if you can sort of see there, well, there's some midtones, right? Midtones, it's going a bit darker. As you can see, it's going darker and darker. Now let's put it on the veil. All right, do you see how it's 255? We actually got some clipping. What that basically means, clipping means that if you go to the end here, like you want to contain usually your histogram within this way. You do not want this particular part of the mountain, so to speak, to clip and to hit that side of the histogram. Remember, shadows, highlights. Remember, like you're shushing someone. That makes you remember that the shadows are on the left and the highlights on the right. Now, does this make this a disposable photograph? This is a bad photograph. Do I just get rid of it? Well, as far as I'm concerned, I eliminated distraction by cropping closer. Yes, these are white and bright. If I exposed for the highlight here, in other words, I want detail in that veil, well, of course, that light is going to be nowhere near as beautiful because we actually use light, the sun, bouncing off a wall, hitting her face. Now, yes, if you entered into this into competition, photographers would say, well, there's no detail on the highlights. That's terrible. Well, don't forget that most of the time, guys, well, most of the time, we should be photographing for our clients. We're not there to actually photograph for other photographers. So just know what you're shooting for. And yes, if you want to be a bit more critical and actually get, make sure that the judges in a competition say, well, this is a perfect exposure. Well, is there such a thing as a perfect exposure? I believe a perfect exposure is pretty much the execution of your desired result. In this case, I'm picking the lesser of the evils. I don't care about the detail here. All I care about is her face looking amazing and having a beautiful direction of light. Now, can I get detail in shadows? You see how I'm going over here. Now that looks a little bit fake. You can sort of see what's happening on the fringe of that highlight there. I would probably say you can certainly do that. That actually looks pretty good, but then I would massage this in Photoshop later on so I don't get that unrealistic sort of glow that's on the outside. So you can see, of course, that the latitude that we have when it comes to digital processing after the fact is just, it makes our life so much easier. But I'm saying don't rely on it because the quality will never be as good and compared to a good exposure in camera under the circumstances and what you're photographing. So like I said, we've got no detail on those whites, but we can bring it back, and that's quite amazing that we can do that. Let's keep on going here. So, and these are just, you know, beautiful images. Let's see if we've got detail here. What we don't want to see in this particular part of the histogram, we don't want to see a luminance value of 255. Now, yes, we are shooting white. See, we're sort of getting there, but we still see detail. But if you look at her face and look at those midtones, then we've also got detail over here as well. Now, here, if it was completely dark and no detail, this will be 0. So you can see this histogram, and there's beautiful peaks, and there's beautiful valleys, and it crosses over. And again, let's go to black and white so we can just see the actual exposure histogram, ignoring the color into it. Now, so your histogram should not always go up and always go down. This is basically just little peaks and valleys of different tones in the image. And you can see how it tapers off over here and it tapers off over here. which basically technically means we got a good exposure, but ignoring the histogram, we do have a good exposure because it's exactly what we want. Now, let me give you a more polarizing shot that arguably you would say is bordering on no detail. Okay, so here we have Dylan, he's just sort of squatting down. We've got a deep dark shadow. Let's have a look and see if we have any kind of detail there. And again, if we don't, this would be 0. So I'm moving the color picker all around, but you can see how those values are not actually clipping. They're not getting to the 0. Now, if you look at the histogram there, you can see how it falls short just of extending out on the left-hand side, and of course it comes back over here as well. Now, yes, you can move this up and down, so you can see the blacks. I'm getting the blacks and moving them, and you see that slider moving this way. Now, if I do it this way, you'll see that the whites are getting, we're changing the value of those whites as well. And then, of course, we've got the midtones that we can use. So you can see how there's 5 sections that we can play with, 5 parts of that image. You've got the shadows, the highlights, and then you've got the midtones representing in those 3 panels. Now, let's go a little bit further here because I want to show you this shot. Okay. So this one, if you looked at that histogram, let's take out that RGB, that looks like a terrible histogram. If you did not look at that photograph and all you saw was that histogram on the back of the camera, someone would say, that's a terrible exposure, you've underexposed it, it's terrible, because we said shadows, highlights. We've got highlights are not even going to the end, which means there's nothing white in this image or nothing close to it. So we don't have that full range. And then we've got those shadows clipping, which basically means that there's going to be points of this image where we will get 0. So there we've got 1. There we go. We've got 0 just there. There we go. It's completely black. There's no detail. Guys, what I'm saying to you is this is a good exposure because that's the desired effect that I wanted. So yes, you can be like me and I look at the back of the camera, or in my case, because I shoot mirrorless, I'm looking in the viewfinder and I've learned to see what a good exposure looks like in my camera. I rely on that, and as you can see, all my exposures are good for my desired result. And there's no shot here, for example, where I'm like, you know what, I didn't nail it in camera. Now look at this shot, for example. We turn the body away from the light source, turn the face back in, we've got detail in those highlights. You know, obviously we've got shadow, highlight. We've got detail basically here. We've got detail in those dark tones, and life is pretty good there. Now, I can increase the midtones. I can give us more detail and highlights. That just depends on your style. It depends on what you like. There is no perfect histogram. We have to say that again. Now, let's just talk about this for a moment. If you look into the camera, let's say you don't have mirrorless. Let's say you have to look at the back of the camera and determine a good exposure from what you're seeing. Well, it's like watching TV. If you watch TV indoors, so if we're watching a TV indoors, there's going to be a certain kind of saturation and contrast that we see because we're looking at TV indoor with no sun hitting the TV. Therefore, it's contrasty and it looks good. But what happens when you watch TV outdoors in full sun? Well, that's no different than actually getting a flary day, a sun's flaring. You know, you may be like me where you have to wear glasses to see up close. And it's like, well, I don't know. I can't even see the detail. I don't know what it is. I don't have mirrorless. I don't know what's going on. Well, you might want to rely on the histogram. But again, I've proven to you that a histogram based upon your desired result, like this one, is actually going to look, the histogram is going to look terrible. Now, can I resurrect some detail if I wanted to? Well, let's see. Let's go back to color. And it'll freak you out that this can happen. But you can actually resurrect the detail. That was a silhouette. Look at that, 5 stops difference of exposure. Now, yes, what happens is that if you don't nail the exposure in camera, you are going to get terrible quality, bad. You're going to get this grain effect. You're going to get this weird tones in the photograph. So I'm saying to you, don't just shoot aperture priority and hope for the best, because that is not going to work a lot of the time, because the minute you have a bride and a groom, so you've got black suit, white dress, and then all of a sudden we've got this white wall, the camera is going to basically see a lot of white, a bit more white here and a bit of black. It'll pretend like it's a paint bucket. It'll mix that paint in, if you're actually photographing with matrix or evaluative metering, where you're evaluating the whole scene, and then it's going to actually make that like a light grey. If the camera sees light grey, it wants mid-grey, therefore underexposing the photograph. What you have to know is, when you look at an image like that, you have to know that you have to technically, well, you have to overexpose, and I say that in inverted commas because you are exposing correctly, but not by what the camera is saying, which means that you have to either, with your ISO, your aperture, or your shutter speed, you have to move the dial, like your exposure compensation, however you want to get there, you have to lean towards the plus sign, because in the camera we have minus, we have plus, we have 0. Plus represents overexposing, minus represents underexposing, 0 represents a good exposure. So like I said, the good way of remembering it is, if your subject matter is bright, you go bright, lean towards the plus. If your subject matter is dark, lean towards the dark, as in with one of your, either your ISO, your shutter speed, or your aperture. So again, guys, that you can read the histogram if you wish. It really depends on what you prefer. But if you read the back of the camera, it's very, very important that you have to determine what that exposure looks like in indoors, outdoors. And also you might find, well, Jerry, I'm looking at the back of the screen and the exposure looked perfect, and I don't know why, when I look at my photographs on a calibrated monitor, I wonder why my exposure is different. Well, your screen in the back of the camera could be too dark or too light. Not all cameras and LCD screens are created equal. So what you want to do when you first get a camera is photograph some different subject matter, what you believe to be a good exposure. In my case, I don't really worry about the histogram, although I know what it means and I know what it reads. But the way I shoot very dramatic highlights and deep shadows and things like that, so my histograms are not going to always look that great. So what I suggest you do is, when you first get a camera, learn what a good exposure looks like on the back of the camera, and that'll be just do a couple of shots, shoot a friend, shoot a partner, whatever. Then now you know what a good exposure looks like on the back of the camera, outdoors, indoors, you name it. Then you load it on your computer. Make sure you have a calibrated monitor. In other words, what you see here in this monitor is what you get in print. Then bring up a photograph and then put that same photograph, put the card back in the camera and compare your screen with a calibrated screen. You might find your screen is too dark. Go into your camera manual and your settings, increase the brightness, and now what you see on the back of the screen is what you get. That's why mirrorless is so good, because you've got a built-in loop where you can shield away all the sunlight coming through, all that crap, and just look at that exposure. What I'm looking for detail in the whites. I'm looking for detail on the skin. The skin is my first guide, then I glance down and I make sure I see detail. Now, you might be saying, well, Jerry, what do I do with, say, African-American skin? Or I've got an African-American groom maybe, and then maybe a Caucasian bride. The biggest problem is that most of the time, most photographers who get that exposure wrong is you're trying to make the African-American skin look Caucasian and get all this detail in the dark skin. I'm saying you can get detail. What I do is I let the Caucasian person be my guide for my exposure. And I'm telling you, the rest will take care of itself. You're overthinking it. And of course, after the fact, whether it's in Camera Raw, whether it's in Lightroom, whether it's in Capture One, of course you can increase that detail in those shadow areas and all that kind of stuff. But you can sort of see how, again, we've got detail there. You can see how this exposure is just, let me go to black and white here. You can see how it's just going short of clipping, and then you can sort of see how those highlights are there as well. So this is a good histogram by the nature of what I'm actually doing. I just say enjoy the ride, guys. Like now here, 100% we are going to get clipping. So we're going to basically see, let's go look right in the candles there, 255, we've got no detail. Well, it's a light source. You are not going to get detail there. It's pure white, because if we are exposing for the result of that light, how would we expect detail in that candlelight? I mean, it's glorified fire, right? Now, if we look over here, we are going to get values of 0. There we go. We've got ones, ones, ones. Can we find the 0 somewhere? No. Surely it'd be somewhere here. No. Okay, there we go. But there you have it, guys. First of all, that is the way you read a histogram. You can get all geeky about it and all that kind of stuff. And if you want it as a guide, you can certainly look at your camera settings and press the display where your histogram is there. But just know there is no perfect histogram. The histogram will be based upon what you're photographing. Like I said, with me, I prefer deep, dark shadows. I don't really care about perfect detail in shadows on every single photograph. I expose for the highlights, as in I want detail in the highlights on the face and the dress. In this case, if we're talking about a wedding, and the rest will take care of itself. So don't overthink it, but just remember the camera can't think like a human. Always remember to think of the complete opposites, and it makes you understand. So let's go over those one more time. If you photograph 4 African-American men wearing a black suit leaning on a black wall, and you were to photograph aperture priority, the camera sees black and says, I don't like black, it'll make it mid-gray, therefore overexpose. And we showed you in our demonstration that if you've got something black, a black suit, then we said that you have to actually underexpose, and I say that again in inverted commas because we are not underexposing, we're exposing correctly, but we are underexposing by what the camera is saying, up to 5 to 6 clicks. And I say clicks as in third stop increments, which means that we are 1 2/3 up to 2 stops under. So let's remember, we said if something is dark, you go dark, lean towards the minus. So you either use your aperture, your shutter speed, or your ISO, or a combination. So you lean towards the minus with your compensation, or you just use exposure compensation like plus and minus, depending on how you like to shoot. So you can shoot aperture priority and use your compensation, but just know, you shoot a black subject, you are going to have to underexpose because the camera is seeing black, and it's not racist. It doesn't care about black or white. It just wants mid-gray. It has to have a standard. If you're photographing a pale-skinned bride wearing a white dress, leaning on a white wall, the camera sees white. It doesn't like white. Again, if you rely on the exposure mode, whether you're shooting on manual or aperture priority, and you move one of those dials that you determine your exposure, you move it to 0, you are going to make what was once white into grey, mid-grey. So what did we say? How do we go from mid-grey to white and detail in those whites? Well, we said it's going to be about 1 to 2 stops. I find it's 1 to 2/3 stops difference. And now, what's in between? If you're photographing a mountain range, and it's a dark mountain, you've got a bit of sunset, you've got a bit of light coming through, you've got some light hitting your subjects, you've got some clouds. So now you've got the blue sky, which is a dark grey sky. Now you've got the clouds, that's white. You've got the dark mountains, that's a dark grey. You've got the skin tones, that's a light grey. Now, mix those tones in. It may not be polarizingly black or white. It might be, say, a dark grey. So here's what you do. The camera's going to make it mid-grey, but you want to go back to where you started to basically get detail in those highlights. And again, the rest will take care of itself. So if we're thinking, you know what, if black is about 1 to 2/3 to 2 stops difference from black to mid-grey, and therefore we have to do that, then maybe a dark grey might be 1 stop. Does that make sense? So once you understand those extremes, the in-between becomes easy. So when you're in your environment and you take a shot and have a look at the back of the camera, and you know that you're about 1 click out, as in 1/3 stop increment out of your exposure, and you need to either under or overexpose deliberately by what the camera is saying, take that shot, done. Shoot that whole scene in that environment, you're done. If you shoot with aperture priority with one subject, and the minute you widen your angle of view, you start to get, your exposure changes with every element that is added into that photograph, but you just want that skin to be beautiful, that white dress to be beautiful. So that's what I'm saying, is shooting manually is going to be more consistent. And when you're converting your files, for example, so when you're correcting your files, if you shoot aperture priority, you'll find your exposures are spiking, they're going forward and back just by shooting that one scene. Here's the thing, if you shoot manual and you forget to actually fix your exposure after you've tested it originally and something's happened, let's say you've got a chunk of 50 photographs that are over or underexposed, well, guess what? You can globally grab them and globally fix them with a couple of clicks. If it was aperture priority, you would have to literally go into every image, every 2 or 3 images, and change the exposure. That is a pain in the butt. So make your life easy. Understand what the camera is doing. Understand exposure. Certainly, you might want to understand the techniques of a histogram, but when we mash that all in, this should be no different to a calculator to an accountant. Know your craft, know the tool of your trade. Exposure should be the last thing you care about. You should be worrying about connecting with your clients, your creativity, and just getting the job done. Hope you enjoyed that. Hopefully that was one of the easiest ways you've ever been explained about how to expose correctly. Enjoy, guys, and practice.